Washington Journal continues.
Peter Lance, what is the government still covering up about the 9/11 tragedy?
Well, the biggest single finding that I discovered when I was investigating the 9/11 Commission was that there's probative evidence that Al-Qaeda was connected to the crash of TWA 800 in 1996. This is the crash where 230 people died on the way to Paris one night, and if that's true, it would be the second biggest act of terror and mass murder in American history. The material, the evidence was presented by a forensic investigator to Governor Keane in early April. Not a word of it showed up in the 9/11 Commission report.
What's the connection between the TWA crash and the attacks on 9/11?
Well, first of all, in my first book, 1,000 Years for Revenge, I make the case that Ramzi Ahmed Youssef, the Mozart of terror, was the original World Trade Center bomber and conceived the 9/11 plot in 1994 in Manila with his uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Everyone acknowledges that Khalid Sheikh is the quote mastermind, but Ramzi was the true genius behind it. Well, Ramzi, in addition to the 9/11 plot, conceived a plot to blow up 12 U.S. jumbo jets heading in from Asia. They called it the Bojinka plot. The plot was foiled when there was a fire in his bomb factory. He was captured with 2 of his co-conspirators, and in the spring of '96, he's awaiting trial for this Bojinka plot in New York. There's a mafia informant on the same tier of the federal jail cell named Greg Scarpa Jr., and Youssef starts passing notes through a hole in the wall. I couldn't make this up in a million years. And these notes, Rob, include intricate bomb schematics, precise drawings, chemical, talking about nitroglycerin, RDX, and Youssef had set a test bomb on a 747 in Manila in 1994, put it under the 26th row, thinking that would blow up the center fuel tank. He was a few rows back, wrong, but it killed the man in the seat, blew a hole in the floor. Now he knows it works. They're going to push the bomb forward, like 25th, 23rd row in the future and blow up a dozen jets. That trial is about to happen. Youssef starts sending this guy messages. I'm worried about the trial. We're going to have a bomb on a plane to get a mistrial because there's an unsequestered jury, and he figured if there's a parallel event, he could argue, well, I'm in jail. How could I have done this? So sure enough, not only did the FBI take him seriously, but if people go to my website, which is peterlance.com, my name, click FBI 302, you can read right now dozens of FBI internal secret, formally secret memos, which say basically that document this. The FBI took it seriously. He predicted he was going to put a bomb on a plane. And the day after it happened, Rob, which happened on the night of the most damaging evidence going into trial, he asked for a mistrial. Then, astonishingly, the FBI, when they put 1,000 agents out in Long Island to investigate, treated it like it was a crime because they had been getting these warnings. They found high explosives, RDX, PETN, and nitroglycerin in the area of the center fuel tank, mirroring exactly the forensic evidence from the bomb in the Philippines that Youssef had set. So James Kallstrom, the ADIC of the New York office, assistant director in charge, was just about to call it a crime, I found in my investigation, when he went to a meeting in Washington, D.C. with Louis Freeh and Jamie Gorelick, later to become famous as one of the 9/11 commissioners. She was then Deputy Attorney General. Whatever was said in that meeting, Kallstrom ran back to New York from LaGuardia on the shuttle, tried to kill the New York Times story the next day that was about to have evidence of the bomb, and literally when the Times refused and ran the story, the next day started saying, well, maybe there are other reasons explosives could be on a plane absent a bomb. They then began investigating, and they came up with this insane theory. If you ask me, I mean, even hearing the theory, when I first heard it, I thought, this can't be true, but they accepted the theory that a canine officer in St. Louis with a bomb-sniffing dog 5 weeks earlier had placed test aids around the fatal flight as it was waiting in St. Louis, and that somehow these aids had spilled, that the officer was negligent, that somehow they'd survived underwater for weeks, and that somehow they were then detectable by the FBI. And do you know, Rob, every single media outlet, the New York Times, Newsday, everybody folded. And the next day, everybody just accepted this theory. Nobody sent any reporter to St. Louis to interview the officer. Even the FBI, with 1,000 agents in New York, didn't send anybody to New York to interview the officer. They used local FBI in St. Louis. Well, I got to that police officer this summer as I was putting my book together. He told me, Peter, I told them I thought I did the test on a different plane. There were 2 747s that day at the Seat Concourse in St. Louis. The fatal flight left at 12:35, fully catered, fully crewed, 200 people for Honolulu. He got off that flight at noon. The plane he did the test on was an empty plane by its nature. He left at noon. There was nobody on the plane. 35 minutes later, the plane that became TWA 800 left. But around the corner on the concourse, there was another plane that left at 1:45. It was an almost identical-looking 747. So add up the dots now. Let's connect the dots, and let's clearly this is circumstantial evidence, but let's consider. You've got a warning by the Mozart of Terror that he's going to put a bomb in a plane. He's giving a mafia informant, and this is documented by the FBI, the precise bomb formula, including what they called later in court Yusuf's signature, the C106 resistor that he wired into a Casio watch. Nobody outside the Justice Department even knew what that was until the summer. This is in May. He's telling this mob guy with a high school education this stuff. He's saying you can use RDX instead of nitroglycerin, which was his original chemical. Then, on the eve of the most damaged evidence going into trial, the plane takes off. And by the way, everybody agrees, the NTSB, the FBI, everyone, that the center fuel tank was the engine of destruction of this plane. The question is why. When the NTSB finally pushed for the mechanical theory and ultimately the FBI agreed, they never found a single piece of forensic evidence to justify it. No wiring, no frayed wiring, no float valve, nothing. It's the single bullet theory of the TWA 800 crash. I believe what happened was Al-Qaeda had gone back in New York City from 1989. I show in my first book that they had established a beachhead in New York. The FBI had Al-Qaeda members under surveillance as early as July of '89. They did the first World Trade Center bombing. They then plotted these 3 incidents in Manila, including the death of the Pope, one of which later went on to become the 9/11 plot. They were foiled, but they executed the mirror plot of Bojinka in New York in July of 1996. By the FBI covering this up, and we can get into the reasons why, what they did was they put Yusuf away for 240 years. They also denigrated the mafia informant Scarpa, who should have gotten a downward release time. He risked his life for 11 months. They called his information a hoax and a scam. They put him in prison for 40 years, Rob, for RICO violations. Now, no murder connected to him at all. So I believe what's happened is the Justice Department made an ends-means decision, and it was really a series of mafia cases that would have come unraveled in the Eastern District if they had credited Scarpa. They knew they had Yusuf for 240 years. Let's move on. They underestimated Al-Qaeda, and now we're paying the consequences. One final aspect of this is astonishing. In this initiative that summer, the FBI set up a phone system where Yusuf could call outside the jail, and they would forward his calls to Asia, to the Middle East. And we know at least once he called Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. The Joint Congressional Inquiry found that. Well, here's his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, who's the only Bojinka conspirator who knows how to build a device, who's still at large. Could Yusuf have communicated to him, I need you to get that on a plane? Well, in fact, he was speaking Urdu and Baluchi, and the FBI was listening with an Arabic translator, and they didn't know what he said. And they may have actually furthered this plot, but at one point Yusuf said that summer, thinking to Scarpa that he had mafia guys, well, if you give me $3,000 in my commissary account, I will introduce you to my people overseas. The FBI paid $500 initially, then refused to pay the other $2,500. For $2,500, the Federal Bureau of Investigation could have been connected with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in 1996 and interdicted the 9/11 plot. And it's all in FBI 302 memos on my website, peterlance.com.
Briefly explain what this book cover-up is about and why you wrote it.
The book basically started out as an analysis of the 9/11 Commission because I developed a source inside the commission who was telling me on a regular basis they're cherry-picking evidence, and this is on the left and the right. This is, this is Democrats and Republicans. They're selectively focusing on the evidence. They're focusing from 1998 forward as opposed to going back to the original World Trade Center bombing. So I began looking at the commission. And as I looked at the commission, I actually testified on the 15th of March before the 9/11 Commission. Governor Keane read my first book, 1,000 Years for Revenge, over Christmas. But the very individual they had take my testimony in closed-door session. And by the way, when I went in to testify, no stenographer, no recording device. There's just a FBI agent who was on the staff and Dieter Schnell, the senior counsel. He takes out a notebook and he's writing notes. I said, well, where's my testimony on the record? Well, I'm going to write this up, and don't worry, it'll go on the record. Well, more than 90% of the witness intake for the commission was anecdotal, Rob. I mean, most people think when they see Condi Rice putting her hand, that's typical. No, more than 90% of their intake was anecdotal. Further, as it turns out, in an irony that I couldn't even make up in my wildest dreams, Dieter Schnell, the very man who took my testimony, who was a team leader for the commission, had been the assistant prosecutor in the Bojinka case, and I have an FBI 302 showing he was a party to this Yusuf intelligence. This man knew that the FBI had been warned that a bomb was going to be placed on TWA 800. Now he's a senior investigator for the commission, and not a word of this showed up in their report.
Let's take a call from Warwick, Rhode Island. Good morning.
Good morning. My question's just a little bit long, but then I'll hang up and listen.
All Rhode Islanders talk long, so I'm from Rhode Island too, so go ahead.
Oh, okay. Based on the administration we have and the ties it has, we had the Regan Bush administration, okay, and their support of Saddam Hussein. The Bush administration also has ties to the Saudis. Okay, we have Vice President Dick Cheney, who in the Senate voted to decrease funding for our intelligence system. Both Vice President Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld violated rules that we had about trading with Iraq. When they were in business, they violated those bans. We have heard bits and pieces about Mr. Bush not paying, in his administration, not paying attention to the intelligence that was presented to them prior to what happened on 9/11. And we don't have a lot of transparency and openness with this administration. I really would like to hear what Mr. Vance has to say, anything that he might have found out regarding all this and how it contributed.
Thanks, Warwick.
Okay, I think the Vice President was a congressman at the time as opposed to a senator. But in any event, I was very critical of the Clinton administration in my first book, 1,000 Years for Revenge. And in this book, in fact, this TWA 800 cover-up happened during Clinton's watch. But I would say that there are three presidencies that bear some responsibility. George Herbert Walker Bush, because it was on his presidency the FBI first had this evidence of an Al-Qaeda cell in New York. Then, of course, the 8 years of Clinton, but also this presidency there were 33 separate warnings and alerts in the summer of 2001. George Tenet said the light is blinking red. Richard Clarke's hair was on fire. The idea that multiple foreign governments from Russia to Israel to Egypt were giving warnings to the United States about a possible terrorist attack. And the fact that this administration, the fact that George Tenet had evidence that Zacarias Moussaoui, the only man who's been indicted in the 9/11 plot, had actually, tried to get permission to learn how to fly a plane but wasn't concerned about landing it, didn't even bring that up at the principals meeting on September 4th, is extraordinary. Further, the defense failures of the day of were the greatest defense failures in American history. And as I go, this book recounts minute by minute using a great book called The Terror Timeline by Paul Thompson, which just came out as well, which we take minute by minute the events of that day. And it's just the president was in the school, Secretary Rumsfeld was virtually incommunicado. He wasn't in the war room at the Pentagon until after the building was hit. Richard Myers, the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was behind doors up on the Hill with Max Cleland. There was an extraordinary series of events that happened that day. The people are going to have to judge in November as to who they think is better served, and it's an epic story. Blame can be spread across three presidencies in any case.
Next up is Iville, Kentucky. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call.
Certainly.
To me, the cover-up occurred under the Clinton administration. He had 8 years. I've missed part of what the gentleman said just now, but I know that Clinton could have done an awful lot in his term, but he didn't do it. He had other things to do. May I add something else that's I have been kind of on the undecided side, and this is one of the reasons. I'm concerned, extremely concerned, about Curry's history of prostate cancer. Now, I don't know anything about Edwards. I don't know what kind of a president that he would be. And all I know about Curry is that when he speaks, he slams or smears Bush.
Ma'am, we're going to leave it there. We're going to try and stay on the topic of this book, Cover-Up. What, in your writing in this book, in your opinion, what responsibility does the Clinton administration bear for the attacks on 9/11?
I think the Clinton administration bears the responsibility in the sense that they didn't pursue bin Laden hard enough. And I think that's one of the things that came out very well in the 9/11 Commission. I'm not trashing everything the 9/11 Commission had to say. They brought out some astonishing findings. I think that but they blame it on the reluctance of the Defense Department under Clinton to take the initiative, There were the, attempts to take him out with missiles, but it could have been much more pronounced. They're all worried, all these, according to, I'm being colloquial here, but the generals were worried about failing. They were just worried about what happens if we continue to fail, politically what it would look like. Could have done a lot more. But on the other hand, this administration had these 7 months leading up to 9/11 where this astonishing warning signs were coming through, and this was the administration that came into power on the promise that they would have a strong military. And the military failures are just incredible. And I wanted to point, can I just say one other thing? The relevance of this book now and why TWA matters, why does TWA 800 matter today? Well, when Condi Rice said there hadn't been any other threat to America prior to the World Trade Center on our soil, if she knew, and give her the benefit of the doubt that she didn't know about this, because I believe that we're a handful of people in justice that knew about this cover-up, it would have been much more significant. Perhaps this administration would have had a greater warning, and perhaps even President Clinton's administration would have taken Al-Qaeda more seriously. Two of the principals involved in this, Valerie Caproni, who was the assistant chief of the criminal division in the Southern District of the Eastern District of New York, she is now general counsel to the FBI. She's the senior lawyer in the FBI. And Patrick Fitzgerald, who was head of terrorism and organized crime in the Southern District, he is now the U.S. attorney in Chicago, and he's the special prosecutor in the Joseph Wilson leak probe investigation. So you have two people who, these FBI memos on my website, peterlance.com, two of the individuals who were intimately involved in this initiative on the intelligence about TWA are now senior people in the Justice Department under President Bush. I've called upon them on the talk shows I've been on to come and answer some questions. Also, I think Dietrich Snell should answer as to why this didn't end up in the 9/11 report, at least a suggestion of it.
Monroe, Louisiana, you're talking with Peter Lance. Good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Go ahead.
Well, I had a couple other questions, seem like everybody else is asking, but I do have two I'd like to ask.
Okay.
I haven't heard any more about it, but if you remember back when we went into Afghanistan, right off the bat, bin Laden was spotted, and they had to call back to Florida to get permission to shoot him. Why hasn't that ever been brought out? Also, I would like to ask him one question about these Taliban that we had in Guantanamo Bay that we let loose, and they've gone back to Afghanistan, and we've killed at least 2 of those or more and captured some. Is that a good idea to let them go back to fight us another day? I'm going to hang up and listen. Thank you.
Well, I'd rather focus on, I don't know the specifics of either one of those, and I would be, I guess, a politician if I commented on something I didn't know. But I would like to say something about the Taliban. Blind Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, people that remember the famous Blind Sheikh, was one of the keys to this entire attack on our country. He was the center of the original Trade Center plot. He was also a spiritual leader of the plot to blow up the bridges and tunnels around Manhattan, convicted, put in federal prison. 2 weeks before the Cole bombing, Osama bin Laden, to give you an idea of how intimate Ramzi Youssef, Khalid Sheikh, the Blind Sheikh are all together, 2 weeks before the Cole bombing, when bin Laden had the famous video fatwa with the dagger, he said, "Free the Blind Sheikh, remember El-Sayed Nosair who killed Rabbi Kahani." And 5 days before 9/11, they offered to exchange the Blind Sheikh for the 6 Christian aid workers in Kabul that the Taliban were holding. So even though the 9/11 Commission claims that Ramzi Youssef and his group were part of a loosely organized group of Sunni Islamists, I say that they were a tightly organized group funded by bin Laden, going back to 1989, establishing a beachhead in this country. And if the 9/11 Commission missed that truth about the origin of this plot, what else did they miss?
Arma, Massachusetts. I'm sorry, Air, Massachusetts. Go ahead.
Yes. Good morning. It's almost surreal that I'm sitting here listening to Mr. Lance. I just finished, and I wonder if he's aware of the book or if he's read it. Jana Davis's book on the third terrorist.
I am.
Oklahoma City bombing. I'd like to know your opinion of that book and the facts, because all of the players in that book seem to be all the people you've just met this morning.
Right.
And you've just kind of completely skipped that whole episode. And that book seems completely well documented. I'm interested to read yours and see how it is done, but it seems very well documented with a lot of big players. How about Bodansky, who did the congressional hearing during that time? You're probably aware of that name.
Yes.
And it seems that you mentioned there were 31 warnings that we had for 9/11. From reading the book, it seems like we had all kinds of warnings, even pinpoint warnings about a federal building in Oklahoma. Just before the bombing. I mean, days before we had warnings.
Thanks for your call.
Yeah. If I can do a little commercial here, my first book, Rob, 1,000 Years for Revenge, I have an entire chapter in that book on the relationship between Terry Nichols and Ramzi Youssef and the allegations that Ramzi Youssef taught Terry Nichols how to build a bomb in Oklahoma City. I was the first reporter ever to break that story in a national forum. But I disagree with Jania Davis. She claims they're Iraqis. I say they're not Iraqis. In any event, Jania and I are both believe that there is a Middle East connection to that bombing. And there's a whole chapter called John Doe Number 2 in my first book, 1,000 Years for Revenge. The reason I didn't focus on it in this book was that I also had mentioned the TWA 800 investigation in my first book, but I didn't have the evidence that I had. And, you know, all reporters are creatures of the deadline, and we were moving to press, and I wanted to focus on TWA 800 for this book. But I believe there's credible evidence, and Richard Clarke even said for the first time in his book that he left the door open that there might have been a Middle East connection to the Oklahoma City bombing.
Next up is White Plains, New York. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd just like to say that I was concerned that your guest noted Clinton's absence of doing something about the terrorist organization, when it seems that he should have also mentioned that the Congress was in a state of total paralysis because all they were interested in was impeaching the president, and there was no way that the president at that time could do some effective work in going after terrorists. If he did, they would have accused him of shirking and doing something he shouldn't. There was no way Clinton could win.
I agree very much. Daniel Benjamin, in this brilliant book, The Age of Sacred Terror, points out how Clinton's hands were tied. He had no ability even to interact or to order Louis Freeh to do anything because he would have been accused of obstruction of justice. There's little doubt that the Lewinsky affair tied Clinton's hands, that doesn't excuse the fact that more could have been done against bin Laden during that period. I mean, you had the African embassies. 1996 is when a guy named Jamal al-Fadl walked into one of the embassies, turned himself in. The CIA had al-Fadl for 6 months, then the FBI. They called him Junior. He was the Rosetta Stone of the entire Al-Qaeda attack on America. He went back to Brooklyn Mosque in 1989. He had actually worked at the same mosque the FBI had under surveillance. He connected all the dots for the Bureau. There was no wall. There was no stovepiping. The FBI knew exactly what was going on. All of this came out in U.S. versus bin Laden on February 6, 2001, months before the 9/11 attack. So one of the things that's always troubled me is I believe the Patriot Act was completely unnecessary. And now the House has got legislation wanting to have even more they want to increase surveillance on American citizens under kind of an expansion of the Patriot Act. If you go back and you just look at 1,000 Years for Revenge, and on my website, peterlance.com, click terrorism, you'll see a timeline that goes 32-page timeline. You can see how many times they blew it. They didn't need a Patriot Act. They just needed to do their jobs properly. And I'm not talking about the street or the brick agents. They're courageous people like Nancy Floyd were trying to do their jobs, and they were routinely thwarted by management in the FBI. This is a management issue, not an agent issue.
Was the 9/11 Commission report a whitewash?
Absolutely. Total whitewash. It was, they gave the public what they wanted to hear. They gave the public some sense of urgency. They shocked the public in many cases by revealing some important evidence. But the fact that they left out even probative evidence of a connection to TWA 800, and more importantly, the fact that Dietrich Schnell, this individual who should have been a witness in front of the commission, was its lead investigator. Do you know that he pushed the plot forward, the genesis of the plot, from 1994 in the Philippines, when I had probative evidence that it was started in the Philippines between Khalid Sheikh and Youssef? He pushed it forward to 1996, and he concluded with his staff that, quote, the evidence is out as to whether or not Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was a member of Al-Qaeda in 1996. Absolutely absurd. And whose word did he take for that, Rob? The word of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which is like taking the word of David Berkowitz for when the first Son of Sam murder happened. They even quote in the 9/11 report in a footnote saying that one of the interrogators called Khalid Sheikh's testimony truth accompanied by a bodyguard of lies. And yet the central date of the 9/11 Commission for when the plot of 9/11 began, 1996, was given to them by its mastermind, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. That's a whitewash.
Dallas, Texas, you're on with Peter Lance, author of Cover Up, What the Government is Still Hiding About the War on Terror.
Good morning. This is my first time calling C-SPAN. I want to let you know you're doing a wonderful job. Mr. Lance, I appreciate the fact that you have mentioned that knowledge about this the things that have gone through several administrations. I think that's important for Americans to know. I have two questions. One thing I want to know, what's the difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? And number two, I'd like to know also, most of the people that they showed on TV that were involved in the bombing in 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. And I'm wondering what's going on with the United States and Saudi Arabia? It makes me feel that because we have relationships with them, we somehow are not investigating Saudi Arabia the way we should, since most of the people that were captured were from Saudi Arabia, not from Iraq. I'm very confused about that, and I hope you will give me some clarification on that issue. Thank you.
Two terrific questions. Well, the Taliban was the radical Islamic government that took power after the Soviets left Afghanistan. They were essentially very friendly to bin Laden. They gave bin Laden safe harbor. Al-Qaeda, or the base, was this network, this terror network that bin Laden created by taking over what was at the time called the MAK. It was a worldwide network for collecting money for the Mujahideen, the rebels that we supported, by the way. The U.S. gave $3 billion at least in aid, which, by the way, the Saudis matched dollar for dollar to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. Only when they left, they turned their attention on us, and we didn't seem to pay attention to that. I think your question about the Saudis is dead on. Another thing that the 9/11 Commission report did, Rob, as you know, is that they basically exonerated the Saudis for 9/11. They gave them a pass, and that has caused great concerns. Craig Unger's book, please get House of Bush, House of Saud. It's one of the best books you'll ever read. I want you to buy Cover Up and The 1,000 Years for Revenge, but Craig Unger's book is fantastic, and he documents the relationship of the Bush family in particular with the Saudis. Senator Graham's new book has pointed out why were 28 pages redacted from the Joint Inquiries Report of Congress, and why do they remain secret from the American people. Clearly, we need to know more about the Saudi potential relationship. Now, Ron Motley of Motley Rice, it's ironic that the gentleman that was here before me from the administration is talking about how they have to limit trial lawyers and have to stop trial. Well, do you know how the truth of 9/11 may eventually come out, Rob? Trial lawyers, Motley Rice and Kreinler, another firm in New York, are suing the Saudi government. They have over 5,000 clients to get to the truth behind 9/11. Who is representing the Saudi government? James Baker of Baker Botts, who's a retainer of the Bush family. That's kind of a curious thing, but it may be that these trial lawyers that many people malign might be the ones that ultimately do what the 9/11 Commission failed to do. Ron Motley is an extraordinary man. He actually made a lot of money in the tobacco legislation, where he fought for the rights of people who are injured in the tobacco companies. He's now fighting the fight to get to the truth behind 9/11.
Peter Lance has spent 15 years as a print and network correspondent. He was last with ABC TV before becoming a story editor and writer for the NBC series Crime Story and Miami Vice. He's also been a co-executive producer of Wise Guys on CBS, Missing Persons on ABC, JAG on NBC, and The Sentinel on UPN. Being involved with these episodic television shows, does that at all call into question your credibility as a journalist, because you go back and forth between journalism and fiction?
Well, I don't really go back and forth anymore. My career has been pretty much in 3 stages. The first stage was as a reporter. I started out in my hometown paper in Rhode Island, the Newport Daily News. I won an award from the Associated Press that was given the year before to the Boston Globe for investigative reporting when I was 18 years old, expose on substandard housing. I won 5 Emmys. I went to Columbia J School. I have a Juris Doctor's degree from Fordham. I made a change in my career when I got married and we had our child, and went to Hollywood and wrote fiction for about 12 years. But I returned to investigative reporting after 9/11 in earnest because I frankly couldn't sit around and write fiction while my country was under attack. And I've used all my skills and what I know as a reporter to try and get to the truth. And I think this is the important thing. I'm just one individual, and I cite in both of my books the great reporting that's been done before me by other reporters, the Washington Post, the New York Times, etc. But the truth of the matter is, if Peter Lance, an individual reporter with just Google, a phone card, tenacity, and shoe leather, could uncover this kind of evidence, why couldn't the 9/11 Commission uncover it? And I think that's the point.
Oakland, California, on our others line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for
taking my call. You're doing a wonderful job. I had a question if Mr. Lance has ever heard of the tape Painful Deceptions and the evidence about World Trade Center building number 7. Thank you.
Well, World Trade 7 is a very, very interesting question, and I began really working heavily on it for this book, and again, you have to pick and choose. Maybe in the next book I'm going to develop it more. World Trade Center 7 is where New York City had its command center. Also, it's alleged that the Secret Service had an office there and other clandestine government agencies, and it went down. It collapsed in the afternoon. It was the only building other than the Twin Tower complex to go down that day, and the fire didn't even start, according to the officials, until the afternoon. They ultimately blamed the fire on the residual fuel tanks that were in the building to power the generators. But the way, from what my understanding is in my investigation of the story, those generators were far removed from the perimeter of the building that might have been interdicted by any burning debris. It's a real interesting question. Also, if you look at the video, there's actually video of the building down. Larry Silverman and other people who was the owner of the complex were, it is alleged that they used the word pull it. We better pull it. And pull it is a term in the building demolition trade for bring the building down intentionally. So the question is whether or not there was such damage that it was damaged by the attack, and that there was such important information in the building that they didn't want to leave it porous and they decided to bring it down, or whether it was brought down as a result of the attack. Now, this is something I've never said before. I'm going to say it here for the first time. There is evidence that an individual was walking out of the garage and he was arrested by the NYPD. He was on a cell phone speaking in Arabic. He was wearing a turnout coat and boots from 10 Engine and 10 Truck, which is the fire company just below the Trade Center. He was arrested by the NYPD. A fire marshal, Andy DeFusco, that I interviewed, went over to him and went to the processing of the man's arrest. He somehow was down. He was a messenger who was down in the World Trade Center area prior to the first plane hitting. As soon as the first plane hit, 10 Engine and 10 Truck, the door went up. He went in and stole a probationary firefighter's coat and boots, and then he somehow found his way into the inside 7 World Trade Center, which is where the city's command center was, and as he emerged after both buildings had collapsed pristine, which clearly meant he was inside that building during both collapse. He's talking on a cell phone in Arabic. He was arrested. The NYPD tried to turn him over to the FBI, and they said, we're not interested. And that is an absolutely true story. His name was Sukru Dal. He claimed to be of Turkish origin. I went to the messenger service that he worked in. They said he had no reason to be there that day, and he basically was given time served, and he's in the wind.
One of our callers, viewers rather, has written an email. A shoulder-fired missile has always been blamed for the TWA 800 tragedy. At the time, I don't think anybody wanted to reveal that terrorists may actually be living among us. Can you speak about the possibility of the missile?
Yeah, the missile, unfortunately, was the theory that confused many people with respect to TWA 800. Many onlookers saw what they believed to be a streak of light that night, and there was a whole missile theory that, and many journalists, including my former colleague Pierre Salinger, were discredited, Rob, over that theory. What happened was when the bomb went off, when Yusuf's Casio nitrate device went off over the fuel tank, it created an event, a flash, and the front of the plane was decapitated, and it immediately plummeted to Long Island Sound. But the rest of the plane continued rising for up to 5,000 feet under its own power, almost like a chicken with its head cut off. I believe that's what people saw. They saw that, they saw the flash, they saw the streak of light, and that's what got people confused. The forensic evidence is extraordinary that the identical bomb trigger powered by a Casio watch with diluted nitroglycerin or an alternative chemical like RDX placed over the center fuel tank as kind of a blasting cap is what did the job. Now, William Tobin was the chief metallurgist for the FBI, and I asked him when he said there was no indicia of metallurgical damage consistent with a bomb. I said, Bill, which model did you use? And he said Pan Am 103. Now, Pan Am 103 was a Toshiba boombox of Semtex explosive that on its own destroyed the plane. This was a different kind of model. When I asked the retired former chief metallurgist of the FBI if he had used the Bojinka forensic evidence of the bomb Yusuf set in the Philippines, he said, what's Bojinka? I almost fell off the chair. This man's ruling was very important to the FBI ultimately siding with the NTSB and the mechanical theory. He never even tested. There were only 2 other bombs that had ever gone off on a plane prior, Pan Am 103 and PAL 434, and he never tested the Yusuf's bomb in the Philippines.
Back to the phones. Washington, D.C. Go ahead.
Mr. Lance, I am reading Cover Up right now. The 9/11 Commission report has left out any questions regarding 5 minutes after the attack on the Pentagon here. As I walked down East Capitol Street behind you, out that window, I was walking down East Capitol Street. I saw a 4-engine plane easing in from the east. I'd like to get that information to you. Can I send it to HarperCollins?
No, just send it to my website. It's Peter.
No, I don't have electronics. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry. No, okay. Send it to HarperCollins.
I will.
10 East 53rd Street, New York, New York.
Got it.
Thank you. Love to connect with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Marietta, Georgia, you're on with Peter Lance. Marietta?
Yes, sir. This is a follow-up on the political restrictions under the Clinton administration. What about the limitation of resources that the FBI was under when they were investigating all of the Clinton scandals? Did you find any evidence that those resources were taken away from these type of investigations?
Well, I didn't find that, but I'll tell you what I did find, and this has been documented by other journalists like John Miller. The fact of the matter is, ironically, there were 1,000 agents assigned to the TWA 800 investigation. Now, John O'Neill, who is beloved, who, as you know, was considered the man in the FBI who was the one that recognized the bin Laden threat better than anyone, who ironically left to become head of security at the World Trade Center and who died that day himself, ironically, John O'Neill. John O'Neill ultimately, according to John Miller, put pressure on James Kallstrom, the New York ADIC, to close down the TWA 800 investigation because he felt it was drawing resources away from the investigation of the War on Terror. I mean, that to me is the ultimate irony. Even a man as astute as John O'Neill didn't understand that there had been this cover-up. And that to me is extraordinary, that all these 1,000 agents who were really working on something related to the War on Terror were ultimately dispersed back to other positions. With respect to Clinton, I just don't have the numbers on that.
One of the things that you talk about in the book is the fact that there were actually war games or testing runs going on in the Washington, D.C. area during the day of the attacks. Explain that.
Well, there are 3 separate war games on 9/11. One was called Vigilant Guardian, which took place in the Northeast Air Defense Sector of NORAD, which covered from New England down to Washington. It was run out of Rome, New York, and Lieutenant Colonel Dawn Deskins, who ran the exercise, was actually quoted later as saying she was confused when the first planes began, reports of the hijacking. There was another one called Northern Vigilance, Rob, over like the northwestern part of the U.S. with Canada. But one of the most ironic ones was conducted by the National Reconnaissance Center, and this is the agency that runs the network of spy satellites. They have a facility near Dulles where one of the hijacked planes took off from, and their exercise was envisioning what would happen if a plane hit one of their buildings. And so those 3 exercises, now virtually none of that is in the 9/11 report. And there were the day of the hearing on the 17th of June, when John Farmer presented the day of report, there was virtually no mention. I think there was a question by Tim Romer at the very end of the hearings. Like that, again, here's one other thing. There were 2 planes, F-16s, from the 177th Fighter Wing of the New Jersey National Guard. There are now 2 different reports. One report was that they're actually airborne over the pine lands of southern New Jersey, and a more recent report we've just gotten, Paul Thompson and I, was that they're on the tarmac ready to take off from Atlantic City Pomona Airport, ready to rock, that morning, and that they were held back on the tarmac and basically were ineffective. Later dispatched towards Pennsylvania, which is kind of ironic. In any event, those planes were 8 minutes from Lower Manhattan, and the 9/11 report says that FAA tried to contact a defunct NORAD base in Atlantic City and got no response. Well, in fact, it wasn't defunct. It may have been defunct for NORAD, but it was an active Air National Guard base with planes that could have at least interdicted the second plane. Even if they had defensively flown toward the plane and diverted it from the tower, they could have minimized the loss of life, and they were never even contacted, and that is not in the 9/11 report.
Norwich, New York, good morning. Norwich?
I just wonder, do you feel that had President Bush returned to Washington after that August 6th briefing, which was pretty definite briefing, and directed the FBI and the CIA and everybody else to get to the bottom of these threats, we might have averted 9/11?
Absolutely. Well, I don't know that it could have been averted. It was well into motion, but I think the fact that the president was on vacation, that he got a daily briefing August 6th that said bin Laden determined to attack the U.S., that there were consistent 31 to 33 warnings throughout the summer, and that there was all this evidence. If the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, had pulled together all the resources of counterterrorism at that moment, including Richard Clarke, brought George Tenet into a room, brought the FBI Acting Director Tom Picard into the room, then they may have learned about the Phoenix memo, about flight schools. They may have connected that to Zacarias Moussaoui. I mean, this is not that difficult to think. Now when you look at what was in front of them, but it needed to be coordinated, and the coordinator at the time was on vacation in Texas. There's no other way to say it. It's the truth. And to me, though, in his absence, George Tenet, the CIA director, to have gone to a principals meeting in September with knowledge of Moussaoui and not even bring it up is incredible. Now, he's gone. Tenet is really, I guess, the only, and his deputy director of operations are the only casualties. People should be asking the following. Why did the 9/11 Commission not have any accountability? Why did they not blame anybody? They keep talking about institutions. Well, people make up institutions, Rob, and how can you say year after year, mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake, nobody gets fired? That's like saying, well, we'll keep Enron's management in place, but we're just going to reposition them. I mean, the widows, Kristen Breitweiser, Lori Van Auken, Mindy Kleinberg, Patty Kazaza, the Jersey Girls, Monica Gabriel, Beverly Eckert, the women who their own heart and soul got this commission into being. That was their main goal, accountability. Let's find out why our husbands died. Let's find out who made the mistakes. And none of it, there's no accountability in the 9/11 report. They said, we don't want to be in the blame game. Well, the American public will have to judge.
Peter Lance, thank you for being on the program.
Thanks so much, Rob. Really great. Thank you.
We want to go now to, well, actually, first we want to tell you that in just a few minutes we're going to open up the phones. We're going to have open phones for about 15 minutes, and then we'll be talking with Ann Lewis from the Democratic National Committee about the 2004 vote. And the numbers there for open phones are on the screen, 202-737-0002, supporting President Bush, 628-0205, supporting Senator Kerry, and 628-0184, supporting all others. But first, we want to check in with Chuck Todd over at the hotline. Good morning, Chuck.